Hey y'all, and welcome back to another edition of Toddling the Stacks. Listen, we have largely been an anti-book banning podcast in our short run here, but book banning is really in the zeitgeist, especially during Pride Month, and I just love it when people are passionate about things. And by people, of course, I mean mostly corporations and powerful interest groups with shadowy funding. But in that zone of book banning, I just want to offer a modest proposal. As long as we're dealing with low-hanging fruit, like books with rainbow flags and openly gay couples on the cover, we can't ever really go far enough. My modest proposal is that we have to just ban books, and certainly we're going to have to ban reading if we want to get rid of these alternative viewpoints. And we're going to present a case study today on just why that is. So stick with us after the break. It's truly salacious, truly insidious stuff, and you're going to want to hear it. Welcome to Toddling the Stacks, a human-produced children's literature podcast where we delve the archive for forgotten treasures to help you make sense of this impossibly large body of work and, hopefully, find some new favorites for your kid. I'm your host, Sean, an Ivy League English PhD with a toddler girl called Adeline, who is somehow even more critical of books than I am. Today, we're looking at 4 individual versions of a traditional and, again, frankly insidious Russian folktale called The Turnip or the Gigantic Turnip. It has a couple different names. Those editions are the Soviet edition that is published in English in the late 80s, the Russian edition that's published in Russian in 2016, the British edition, which is published in English around 1998, and Grandma Lena's Big Old Turnip, which gets its own fancy name in the US edition of 2005. I'll be referring to them throughout in this way, the Soviet edition, Russian edition, British edition, etc. But you can find any information that you want about these in the show notes on the website, authorship, publication, translation, illustrator names, as well as images to help guide you through our conversation as well. Those are all on the website. In this essay, I'm going to demonstrate that banning individual books will never suffice, that to truly eradicate alternative viewpoints, we need to ban literature and reading. And so what is this story? What is this traditional Russian tale? It's a cumulative tale, and I can best explain that by just sort of going over the basic plot. This is the thing that happens in every version of the story. Someone plants a turnip seed. That turnip seed grows into an absolutely monstrous turnip. And so they try to pull it up, and they can't because they're not strong enough. And so they enlist the help of someone else, and the two of them together attempt to pull it up, but they can't because they're not strong enough. And this is how it becomes a cumulative tale. It's just a repetition of this over and over again until however many actors get involved. And ultimately, at the end, it's just the smallest actor that provides the force needed to make the turnip out of the ground to everyone's great excitement. There are differences among these editions, differences in who plants the turnip, differences in whether or not the turnip is eaten. And we'll take a look at those differences. We'll take a look at the differences in artwork. And we'll use those to create a kind of general sort of surface level analysis before moving on to our own cumulative analysis of what the turnip broadly represents in our light of book banning. So I want to start with the Soviet edition, which is actually a really beautiful edition. It's colorful. It's presented in a socialist realist style that is mixed with a kind of folk art. It's definitely worth reading and is available on the Internet Archive. In this version, we have the grandfather, the grandmother, the granddaughter, a dog, a cat, and a mouse who are ultimately needed to pull the turnip up. And as I understand it, this is the most traditional version, most traditional framing of this tale, these specific actors, going back to the story's initial introduction in the mid-19th century when it's first published in a sort of Grimm Brothers-like anthology. The reason for this, again, as I understand it, is because of the way that these titles of grandfather, grandmother, granddaughter rhyme in Russian. In this story, the grandfather is the one who plants the seeds, and it is only the humans who eat. The art, as I've said, is a kind of socialist realism with folk art, and I think that it's very reminiscent of Rodjanowski's style in Froggy Went a Courtin', which is the one that won the Caldecott in 1956. And I've mentioned the colors a little bit, but the end frame, I think, which is again in the show notes, is something that is really worthy of analysis. You'll see a stately grandfather who with very broad shoulders, a white fluffy beard. Throughout the tale, he has been illustrated in ways that suggest his musculature, his large hands, that bring dignity to a Russian peasantry, to the strength of the farmer. His wife, the grandmother, and the granddaughter alike have really rosy cheeks, fully fleshed out faces. They're just frankly plump in a way that makes them pleasant and appealing. In this final frame, after they've pulled the turnip up, they are eating a turnip stew that's been made with it on a small table that is barely large enough for all of them. And yet the grandfather's face is somber, but the granddaughter and the grandmother very joyful. And it gives you a wonderful feeling of this collective effort. Beneath them, the dog and the cat and the mouse that help to pull up the turnip are subservient to them and not partaking in the meal. As an overall work, I think that this, of course, as we might predict, and again, this is surface level analysis, lends itself to the notion of communism, right, to that dignity of the peasantry, the importance of future generations, and of course, the distribution of food according to need and according to what they've contributed to the production of that food. And so nothing here seems insidious just yet. This is a story about how we work together to overcome a problem, and we'll see that time and again. We see it in the British edition, and here a little bit different than the Soviet edition. We have an old man and an old woman who aren't characterized as grandparents. They have no family, they just have farm animals. This edition is much more about counting and learning the differences between seasons, and even learning some very rudimentary basics about gardening and farming. And so it's instructional for children in that way. Instead of the other members of the family, we have farm animals, including a cow, who you would really expect to provide more torque, the most torque out of anything in these stories. And yet he requires even more actors behind him than any other story. So he's certainly not putting out in the sort of boxer-esque way we might expect of the Soviet edition. This story also ends with a mouse. Here, the couple both together plant the seeds and everyone eats. And unlike the Soviet story, the mouse eats the most. And he gets cheese alongside the turnip as well, and we're not really sure where that comes from. The art is very different in this story in comparison. This is not realism at all. It's moved much more into the primitive, much more into the folk art category. Bodies here are distorted, they're almost grotesque and bulbous, and the ratios change and shift throughout. Sometimes we have short legs, sometimes we have long legs, in ways that might just be amateurish attempts at perspective, but don't really come across that way. It seems as though these bodies are actually shifting in strange ways. I think what we might be able to do in terms of surface level analysis of this particular book is just to see it as a sort of transmutation of the story into something that honors British stoicism and resourcefulness, that harkens back through the couple's age to the war, right? This sort of sense of British making do, of keeping the stiff upper lip, keeping calm and carrying on, all of that sort of thing. And you'll notice that both this and the Soviet analysis rely on very surface level stereotypes. But those readings are readily available to us. I think that we can back these up with the actors and the differences that we see against the core scaffolding of the story. So let's do the same thing to Grandma Lena's Big Old Turnip. Here we have Grandma Lena, Grandpa, Uncle Isidore, Aunt Nettie, Rascal the dog, and Baby Pearl. It's not clear whether all of these folks live together in one space, but we've certainly in this story moved from the space of the generic farm that we know nothing really about in the British and Soviet editions to a much more urban setting. This is a sort of victory garden either in front of or behind a brownstone. In this story, it's Grandma Lena who plants the seeds after considerable calculation based on the names of the seeds in the seed catalog. But at the end, it's everyone who eats. And this isn't just the actors of the story, and this is unique to Grandma Lena's Big Old Turnip. The entire community takes part of eating this turnip. Though it is Grandma Lena alone who prepares it, the rest of the community also brings other sorts of food alongside them. The art here is more cartoonish than either of the previous examples, but the bodies are somehow more true to life, even than the Soviet realist one. Their faces are more expressive in their labor. I think that's part of what makes them more true to life. And their individual character is expressed through distinct clothing and features. They don't seem like stand-ins or chimera, which is a word I use a lot. They seem like people who the illustrator understood to be people with lives, right? Characters that have a backstory that can be expressed in these small moments, even though it's not expressed in the text. It's an elevation that makes this story rather nice. This story, conversely, as opposed to the other ones, centers a matriarchal structure that we see in many African-American families and in much African-American literature. In Grandma Lena's decision to plant the turnips, in her maintenance of the turnips, and in her staying up after everyone else has gone to bed to prepare the turnips for the community. And it centers African-American foodways as well in this sort of communal celebration that we see, and we even saw in last week's episode for Juneteenth with the gathering table. In that it creates something more than just the basic moralism of this story, which is the cumulative tale of everyone getting together to overcome. It paints a more real world. It creates more meaning and allows for this to expand outwards into something that can be consumed and understood by folks. And then there's the Russian edition, Repka, which is the same basic story as the Soviet edition. But in this one, for the first time, no one eats the turnip. We don't know what happens to it at all. The story ends with the turnip being uprooted and the mouse flying off of the screen on the last page into extra diegetic space. This art is just truly strange. It's cartoonish, not realistic at all, but it's like, I don't know, think Rugrats meets Ren and Stimpy, right? It's much more grotesque than the British edition, where I already said we had bulbous sort of bodies. These bodies are inhumanly thin, but also bulbous in a way that suggests more like cancer than misformed life. Not something alien, but something sick. The grandmother and granddaughter's dress kind of adds to that. It's different. It's not something that we would expect to see folks wearing while they were farming. It just seems out of place. It really suggests a sort of distantiation for us that this is something that is strange. Adding to that again, all the animals in this story are just super highly anthropomorphized. The mouse is literate. We don't really know why. He's walking around with a book. So there's just all these strange things that just create distance that make us want to question everything about this story. And as a surface level interpretation, what I want to suggest is that this is a world in which the human has been devalued in juxtaposition to the primary source text where the peasant has to be revered, right? And we might think quite a lot about that in terms of the Russian oligarchy and what that looks like to be a human that has to depend on sustenance farming in a world that also features obscene wealth. And so for each of these, we have the ability to look at differences and to look at these individual instantiations of actors who help to pull up the turnip and to create new meaning based on the differences that each iteration provides. And this is one feature of literature in large that makes it super volatile and super uncontrollable, and in some sense then super dangerous, right? Because it depends on how we interpret each of these things as to what it means. And how on earth do you legislate that? How on earth do you ban that? And this is a question. So in each reading of this story, I've assumed that the turnip is merely a symbol for some problem that's too large for the individual to bear. That is, that its meaning can't be fixed either, right? Like, we talk about what the different actors mean, we talk about the societal moment that these are published in, and we can provide these sort of very generic readings that get placed on top. But overall, all of these become stories about how a given culture solves its problems. And I think that's right, but the turnip is the only constant. And to ignore the turnip, I think, creates a huge problem for analysis and exegetical concerns. So what is the turnip? Well, the turnip is something that festers in darkness, growing larger and larger until one day it can't be ignored anymore. Then actors from all walks of life come together to unearth it. Everyone is universally happy when they do, and for the most part, everyone consumes it gleefully. And we have to remember, of course, that you are what you eat, even if this is a cliche. And in this way, I think it becomes clear that the turnip is nothing more or less than a symbol for the kinds of queer literature that we've been discussing. And how insidious is this? I mean, this is a story with absolutely ancient roots. It goes very far back into Russian culture. It's first published at nearly the same time when Tsar Nicholas I had made homosexuality punishable by exile to Siberia. And it gets through with no problem. It's actually revered as part of the long history of Russia. And in our edition specifically, it's made it through Soviet censors. It's made it through England's Section 28. It's enmeshed itself in traditional African-American values and foodways. And it's survived a Russian government that declares open expressions of pride to be criminally extreme. There is not a good time in any of these iterations for this to be a metaphor or a symbol for homosexuality. And yet, if we view the turnip in this way, it must clearly be that. And so it becomes the turnip, a veritable wolf in sheep's clothing and proof that surface-level book bans can't ever be enough. Hopefully, it's obvious that this has been satire. Book bans aren't. Book bans are deadly, deadly serious. The American Library Association reports that 2025 saw challenges to over 4,000 titles, and that essentially ties 2023's record for the most books challenged in a year. 39% of those, quote-unquote, represent the lived experiences of LGBTQIA plus people and people of color. Books providing representation for transgender folks are under special attack, with bills like H.R. 7661 specifically seeking to outlaw them at the federal level. Now, most people are against this. The ALA commissioned polling that showed that overwhelmingly and across party lines, Americans oppose banning books and trusted librarians to curate appropriate collections for their patrons. And in turn, most book banning efforts don't begin with individuals or concerned parents, but rather with well-funded special interest groups. But while H.R. 7661 is unlikely to pass, similar efforts at the state level have proven much more successful, with a considerable majority, 66% of those challenged in 2025, being banned effectively at some level. And that's a chilling thought because it's clear to me that book bans won't stop there. They never have. And there are whole periods of time where reading has been criminalized, where certain populations have been not taught to read, or where literature has been written in languages that they were not allowed to be taught, Latin, for instance. This is a very slippery slope. Banning shuts down valuable dialogues that we could be having about literature and its highly formative effect on young people. I don't think anyone disagrees that parents and educators should be working together to do the best thing possible for our children. And that's work that people, and I definitely do not mean corporations or shadowy and powerful special interest groups here. That's work that people need to do together in the communities and in their classrooms. And it's not work that we can do when books are being outlawed, when the government is actively stepping into these conversations and shutting down dialogue. This should be something that parents and educators and librarians are discussing together. As always, thanks for listening. Stay safe. Get your kids to the library and keep on reading together. Bye, y'all.
This has been Toddling the Stacks. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your podcatcher of choice for new episodes every Monday, and follow us on Insta, Blue Sky, and Facebook for the latest updates. If you like what you hear, leave us a review. Keep up with Adeline's reading now, find links to buy your favorites, and more at toddlingthestacks.com. Address questions or concerns to pod, that's P-O-D, at toddlingthestacks.com. Graphics for today's show were created by Emily Tatro. Make a website so people can hire you, Emily. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.